Narration of the book, Eat Like You Care. But what if I were on a desert island starving to death? The short answer to the question posed by this but is that you aren't. Nor are you stranded in the middle of the ocean, adrift on a lifeboat with another human being and a cow, and someone has to be thrown overboard. Nor are you passing by a burning house that holds 2 occupants, a human and an animal, only one of whom you have the time to save. This but and similar ones seek to identify a situation in which consuming animals might be necessary, but which you are not in, and then generalize to situations in which you are, where there is no necessity to consume animal products. It doesn't work. For some reason, many of us seem to want to formulate general moral principles on desert islands, lifeboats, and while standing in front of a burning house. These are notoriously bad places to try to devise moral rules because they usually require that we choose amongst several morally unsatisfactory choices in a situation of emergency. We then seek to generalize that choice to cover situations in which the emergency that limited the choice does not exist. But let's go to the desert island. There you are, starving to death, and there is neither a coconut nor a carrot available. There are, however, rabbits, although we are not sure what they are eating if there is no vegetation on the island. It is morally acceptable to kill and eat a rabbit in such circumstances. Let's assume that it is. So what? What does that tell those of us who aren't starving to death on a desert island about whether it is morally acceptable to eat a steak tonight? It tells us nothing. In the first situation, there is a conflict. In the second, there is not. Our moral intuitions tell us that in a situation of true conflict, humans prevail. So eating the rabbit on the desert island is morally acceptable according to that intuition. But that intuition has nothing to do with situations in which there is no conflict. Let's think about the situation in a human context. You are stranded on the desert island with John and Mary. You are all starving, but John is also ill and will die soon. You and Mary kill and eat John. Yes, it's a disgusting thought, but things like this have happened. It's still murder, and it's still a crime, but it is often punished less severely because we understand that as a moral matter, killing and eating John in such a circumstance is different from garden variety murder. Eating John in such circumstances, although wrong, would at least be understandable and would not merit the sort of moral condemnation evoked by other acts of unprovoked homicide. After all, if you are starving, you don't really have a choice, and moral condemnation requires that you were able to choose differently but did not, and choose to do the wrong thing. Similarly, in the example involving the rabbit, I have a choice of starving to death or killing the rabbit. That's not really a good choice. In fact, it's not really a choice at all. So why should we apply the analysis that would make sense in a situation in which there is no choice to a situation in which there is a choice? We would not say that even if an act of cannibalism in an extreme situation of isolation and starvation is morally excusable. Eating another human is fine whenever you feel hungry and choose to eat another human because that is what you prefer. What is morally tolerable in the situation in which there is no choice is not necessarily tolerable in the situation in which there is a choice. Similarly, the fact that we would say that it is morally acceptable to eat a rabbit in a similar extreme circumstance does not mean that it is acceptable to do so when there's a choice. Now assume that you have been rescued from the desert island. You are now walking down the street and you pass by a burning house containing a human and a dog. Our moral intuition tells us that in situations of real conflict, humans win and animals lose. We promised not to upset our moral intuitions and we're making good on that promise. So whom do you save? You save the human. After this terrific act of heroism, you head home to eat dinner. What does your choice of saving the human tell you about the morality of eating chicken for dinner? Nothing, absolutely nothing. Our moral intuition may tell us that in situations of genuine conflict between humans and animals, humans win. But our intuitions also tell us that in situations in which there is no conflict, we cannot inflict suffering on animals simply because we get enjoyment from doing so. Again, to see this clearly, all we need to do is consider what we would think if the burning house contained 2 humans. You don't know either human, but one is a great deal older than the other, and your moral intuitions tell you that you ought to save the younger person simply because she is younger. Would you conclude from this that it would be acceptable morally to torture older people? Start farming them, or start using them in biomedical research? Of course not. Your moral intuitions might lead you to save the younger person precisely because you could only choose one to save. In that unhappy situation, you choose to save the younger person. But that choice leaves completely unaffected your other intuition that hurting someone, anyone, requires a moral justification. There is a tendency to use these desert island, lifeboat, burning house scenarios to demonstrate that because our moral intuition is that animals have moral value but less moral value than humans do, and because we would choose the human over the animal in a genuine conflict situation, that animals suddenly have no moral value and we can inflict suffering on them even when there is no conflict? But that simply does not follow, and it explains why many of us feel deeply uneasy about continuing to consume animal products in the absence of any necessity. Even if we think that animals have less moral value than humans do, the point of this book is that if they have any moral value whatsoever, we cannot justify imposing any suffering on them just because we get enjoyment from it. Similarly, just because we would choose one human over another in an emergency situation, that does not mean we would support the view that it is acceptable to subject some humans to any suffering just because we enjoyed it. If animals matter morally at all, if they are not just things or ingredients, imposing any suffering on them because we enjoy it or the results of it cannot be morally acceptable. So the fact that you would eat the rabbit on the desert island or throw the cow out of the lifeboat does not in any way affect the moral principle that imposing unnecessary suffering is morally wrong and suffering for the sake of palate pleasure is, by definition, unnecessary. A variation on this but involves people who live in places where they don't have a choice of what to eat. There are a few examples of indigenous people in remote parts of Canada or on the African continent, Kenya for example, who consume a diet of meat where there are few or no non-animal foods. The idea is that such situations are similar to the desert island scenario where one can choose to eat animals or die. We don't need to get into factual inquiry about people in Canada or in Africa and whether they really have no choice and must eat animal foods or perish. The position we are arguing for here is that in any situation in which there is really no choice, animal use could be considered morally acceptable under the conventional rule that we should not impose unnecessary suffering. In situations in which there really is no choice, there is a sort of necessity that removes the conduct from the prescription of the general moral rule. But our guess is that just as there is no one reading this who is stranded on a desert island or adrift in a lifeboat, there is no one reading this who lives somewhere where he or she really has no ability to get non-animal foods. The point remains, for anyone who does have a choice, and that includes just about everyone reading this right now, a choice to impose suffering in the absence of necessity violates what we claim to be the moral principle that we all accept. To hear the next chapter, please go to my next video on my YouTube page. Please like and subscribe.